Hello and welcome back to my 1v1 Arena tier list video series. Last video I talked about the S tier civs, and in this video I'm going to be focusing on the next tier, the A tier civs. So let's get into it. So when I think about the A tier civilizations, these are civs that I consider to be almost as good as the S tier civs. They can have good ecos and or good late game armies, though they're typically not as diverse and or as powerful as the S tier civs. They may also be weak at certain stages of the game and or have one or more key flaws with their ecos, their late game, or their tech trees. So to start my A tier, we have the Incas. Now this is my personal favorite Native American civ, just because they feel the nicest for me to play, mostly because their tech tree is the widest of the three Native American civilizations when you compare them to Aztecs and Mayans directly. And they suit my playstyle the best, which tends to revolve more around decision making, macro, especially late game macro, and transitioning units a lot, that kind of flexibility. And the Incas and their tech tree definitely lend themselves well to that kind of playstyle. So it's really difficult, if not impossible, to hard counter the civ because, again, their tech tree is quite diverse. You can think of them as like a Native American Byzantines if I had to think of a different civilization that's known for countering, because they have an above average answer to every single unit type in the game, and for some unit and multiple unit types to fight any sort of threat that can come out against them, actually. So when you think about it, against cavalry they have fully upgraded halbs as well as their Kamayuk unique unit, which when employed en masse can rip apart even the strongest cavalry in the game, with perhaps the exception of maybe the Byzantine cataphract. But literally any other type of cavalry, when cams are used en masse, they'll just shred them up, even elephants. Against infantry, they have fully upgraded arbs, they have their slinger unique unit, which you can think of as like a type of hand cannoneer with just a lower base attack. Heavy scorpions with siege engineers if you want to use those. And against archers, they have their patented elite eagle warriors with couriers, giving them up to 10 pierce armor, as well as siege ram access, as well as fully upgraded elite skirmishers that get a decent boost with their Andean sling unique technology, removing their minimum range. This makes them a bit less vulnerable to melee units like infantry and cavalry, although you'd still want other supporting units to help deal with those units, and not just your skirms. And even against enemy siege, and they have monks with block printing and redemption, as well as elite eagle warriors, and so they were really well equipped to deal with any sort of threat that can come out against them again. And the only unit types that I can think of that can potentially give them problems is probably really good gunpowder. So think of the S tier civs. I had Spanish, Turks, Portuguese, those civs that have very good gunpowder for a variety of reasons. That can give the Incas a bit of a hard time, as well as siege, but the caveat here is the siege preferably needs to have heresy, because without heresy they're just going to get converted by the Incan monks, and you're probably going to end up doing more damage to your own armies than you are the Incas. So yeah, you definitely need heresy. And even with these units though, they're still not hard counters to Incas, so it's just a very nice civ to play, knowing that whatever your opponent comes at you with, you're going to have an above average answer to them. The next point to make is the fact that one-dimensional civs will have it especially hard against late game Incas. So think of maybe civs that are very reliant on cavalry, if we're thinking about cavalry civs, like for example maybe Persians who just need cavalry to make a very strong late game death ball, or archer civs like perhaps Britons, or to a lesser extent maybe post-imperial age Mayans and Vietnamese as well. And maybe for infantry civs like Slavs, or perhaps even Malay, things like that, they're probably going to have a bit of a difficult time dealing with Incas in the late game. The main downsides to the Incas that I can think of though is the fact that, one, they don't have much of an eco bonus. And their most impactful eco bonus is probably the fact that their houses can support 10 population as opposed to the regular 5. So in theory, they need half as many houses as a regular civilization. And this can save a decent amount of wood in the long run, although it's obviously not as impactful as the Huns bonus. You can think of the Incas housing bonus as the Huns housing bonus divided in half. So the Huns can save anywhere from, I believe it's like 1,200 to 1,600 wood, depending on how you go about calculating the savings with the cost of the house itself, as well as the villager time needed to build those houses. The Incas can save around the range of like maybe 600 to 800, so it's a nice bonus, but compared to the eco bonuses of many of the S tier civs, they just kind of fall flat in that regard. They don't have any cavalry access, being a Native American civilization, duh. So in the late game, if they find themselves at that stage of the game, they're going to have to spend gold in some way, shape, and form in order to try and close out the game, whether it's their Eagle Warriors for raiding, or if it's investing in some siege rams to pair with their halberdiers to try and push into their opponent's base and take out buildings and that sort of thing. They're also lacking a bit of a power spike that many of the S tier civs have, like for example Aztecs, their Native American cousins, so to speak, who have a very strong early Imperial Age power spike with their own superior elite Eagle Warriors that are created faster, and their great economy with their boosted farmers that can get them to Imperial Age in a timely manner. So, and that's mainly due to the fact that I think Incas as a civilization, I think, are all about countering and responding to what the opponent is making. Not necessarily a defensive civilization. I mean, I've certainly heard criticisms of the idea of that Incas is a defensive civ, and I personally don't see them as much of a defensive civ so much as they are a reactive civ. So they might try to set the tone, the opponent will try and respond to what they're making, and so the Incas can respond with whatever they're making by hard countering whatever it is their opponent's making, whether it's Kameyuk slingers, eagles, monks, anything like that. Anything that their tech tree has to offer to really help them counter whatever their opponent's making. But still, I love this civ, and I think it's definitely worthy of a spot in the A tier at least, and overall it's actually a top 5 favorite civilization of mine, not just on Arena. Moving right along to the second civilization in my A tier, we have the Britons. Now, the Britons' main claim to fame is obviously their archers. They receive a variety of boosts helping out this particular unit line. So for starters, their longbows or their crossbows are excellent choices for taking map control because they get extra range as a civ bonus. And it can really help them secure map control or even go aggressive. Like you see stuff like castle drops and longbow pushes combined with siege quite often on Arena, and it's a nice strategy to go for. They also have a solid early and mid-game economy with their shepherd bonus, 25% faster shepherds, as well as their cheaper TCs, 50% cheaper in wood cost. And the cheaper TCs especially can open up for the potential for a strong economy behind even the tightest builds. So I'm thinking, I talked about with this with Portuguese in the last video, 25 plus 2 castle drop into your unique unit that costs wood and gold if you start with a mill before a lumber camp. And Britons is probably my second favorite civilization for doing that kind of strategy with. And the fact that they can build their town centers for so cheap means they have the potential to have a really nice boom behind even a really tight strategy like that. So it's a really nice combination of eco bonuses helping them out. Most civs will really think twice about using onagers or scorpions against Britons because, again, their archers can just snipe those units from a mile away. I'm thinking back to series like, I believe it was Masters of Arena 3, the final between Viper and MBL, where it was Britons versus Celts, and you would think in the late game it would massively favor Celts, but unfortunately with the way MBL was playing them out, with going siege onagers, and Viper being the first-class micro player that he is, was just able to just kite back with his longbows forever and just snipe all the siege onagers as they came. It was just a huge resource drain for MBL, so I'm kind of reminded of games like that. And so yeah, that's just the kind of insane value that Briton archers can give you, assuming you have the micro and the skill to be able to make sure you keep them alive. They have an amazing early in power spike with arbalests that have the potential for 10 range, later on 11 when you grab yeomen, but we're talking early Imperial Age, so chances are you're probably going to be spending your wood and gold, which are the 2 resources that the yeoman technology costs into other things like your archery ranges, masking up arbalests, maybe renewing your farming eco after you're done booming in the mid game, things like that. Unfortunately for Britons, they have mediocre monks. They miss redemption, they miss heresy as well as atonement, and it can really take away the option of using monks at all for any kind of aggression. Although for a supportive role against things like heavy cavalry, elephants, that sort of thing, they can still work fine. And obviously they're monks, so you'd still want to be using them to grab relics. And with your boosted range units, you have a good potential to secure map control to grab the relics. On top of that, their siege is somewhat lacking. They miss siege ram, they miss siege onager and bombard cannon, but they do at least have siege engineers as well as amazing trebuchets with the Warwolf technology. They are my personal favorite trebuchets, although I guess the argument could be made for Japanese trebuchets with kataparuto. But personally, I like Warwolf trebs better because it's just about impossible for you to lose a treb war as Britons, assuming you have this technology researched. Combined with the lack of thumb ring as well as the fact that the Britons' cavalry isn't really that stellar, they miss bloodlines and they don't get Hussar or Paladin, the Britons can have a really tough time of it against comparable or even arguably better archer civs in the game. So I'm thinking of civs like Mayans, Ethiopians, and as much as I hate them, even Vietnamese in the post-imperial stage of the game when they have their tankier archers out on the field. The Britons can really struggle against these types of civilizations. Civs that have infantry with high pierce armor, I'm thinking of civs like Goths or Malians. They can also give Britons a bit of a hard time, as well as the Native American civilizations with their eagle warriors. The Britons kind of have to rely on their swordsmen, which admittedly they're good it's perfectly good swordsmen if they get full upgrades on their champions, but other than that, they're going to have a hard time of it against these sorts of units and these sorts of civs. Of course, being Britons, I have to mention their most traditional flaw, and that is their vulnerability to siege ram pushes, especially early on. Britons are so vulnerable to siege rams that in many cases, you can justify, assuming your civilization has access to siege rams, just putting down a handful of siege workshops on your way up to Imperial Age, mass up like a dozen plus rams, get all your ram upgrades, release them, and just head straight for your opponent's base and just completely screw up their game plan. If the Britons player is not careful and just makes nothing but archers during the mid game, you can really capitalize on this fact that they just love to open with archers, and just whether it's for the mid game or if it's early Imperial Age, and just really exploit this fact and potentially even end the game with just a full YOLO siege ram push. The last major flaw to point out is the fact that they're not very pop efficient in the late game. Their foot archers, while the extra range is nice, when you compare them to other super pop efficient things like elephants or paladins or siege onagers and things like that, the Britons really do fall apart in the late game because they have none of these units. Though it is fair to point out that with their extra range on their archers, as I point out with the Viper and MPL game from Masters of Arena 3, you have the potential to keep your gold army alive for a long time, so you still have options for the late game, even if they're not the best out there. Coming in at number 3 on my A tier, we have the Byzantines, a traditionally strong arena civilization back from the AOC days, and they're still pretty good on arena. So one of the Byzantines' main selling features is the fact that they have one of, if not the widest tech trees in the game. On top of that, their most significant bonus when the context of a 1v1 arena match is probably their cheaper Imperial Age advance. They get it for about 33% less. And this means they can have a really good time advantage for literally any strat that they can go for. So if they're smushing, they can get to Imperial Age super fast and grab important monk techs. If they're booming on 3 or 4 town centers, they can get them to Imperial Age a little bit faster for a bit better early Imperial Age push. Or maybe if they're taking Scout or Expo for map control, then they can have a decent uptime off the back of that as well. So it's just a really nice flexible bonus to have at your disposal. On top of that, they have solid defensive capabilities with their higher HP buildings. So they're quite trust resistant because their towers are extra tanky. Their town center, important buildings like town centers and castles are more resilient to siege attacks because of their extra bulk. And the castles especially are the single best castles in the game for defending against siege pushes, because they can max out at 8,131 HP after getting hoardings. So they're just very tanky, very bulky castles that can stand up for a very long time. They can counter almost everything thrown against them because, again, they're a vast tech tree. So when we think about the major unit types, we're thinking, for example, cavalry. They have discounted halbs and camels. Both miss blast furnace, and in the case of camels, they also miss bloodlines, which are notable losses. But I think, at least in the case of the halbs, you'd want them. I think you'd prefer to have them discounted. At least for me personally, if you're just facing a lot of cavalry, you just want to be able to pump out as many halberdiers as you can just to answer that threat. Against infantry, they have fully upgraded arbs, hand cannons, and even their cataphract unique unit. It's a bit difficult to get to them, but assuming you play a certain style, like let's say you're booming and you're playing defensive, it's definitely possible with a decent map that you can get up to them. Against archers, they have discounted skirms and siege rams and things like that. They also have onagers, although they're pretty generic onagers, not having siege engineers and things like that, but still, it's an option that they can use. So, and against enemy siege, they have their great monks as well as their bombard cannons, which again miss siege engineers, but still, they can still be useful in a variety of situations. Speaking of their monks, they have an amazing selection of monk techs, missing only herbal medicine. And combined with their faster healing rate, they can make for a nice candidate for a smush, as well as with their cheaper Imperial Age advance time. So, in my opinion, one of the best civilizations for a smush or a fast stint monk treb push, because, again, their faster uptime means they can really end up catching their opponents off guard with a really quick uptime, get out important technologies like block printing, illumination, theocracy, and if you are on stone, you can just build your castle up front and push with trebs, that sort of thing. So it's just a very nice set of bonuses working well together. They're also one of the best trash war civs in the game because of their discounted halbs and skirms. This means that in any kind of sort of trash related fight, assuming it's just the regular trash units, halbs, skirms, hussars, that sort of thing, the Byzantines will always come out on top regarding the resource trade, regarding the cost effectiveness in those sorts of engagements, those late Imperial Age engagements. And really the only sort of trash quote unquote civs that can compete with them, that can probably deal with them effectively, is the Malay with their trash two-handed swordsman, and I guess maybe you can argue Spanish and maybe even Magyars with their own great trash tech trees, and in the case of Magyar Hussars, if they still have castles up and running. Unfortunately for the Byzantines, they have a few problems. The first is, again, when I mentioned their camels, their lack of bloodlines and blast furnace, and this really hurts their cavalry and other infantry as well. So while they have access to a great stable tech tree, and though they have access to champions, none of these units are really all that great because of these missing technologies. So they're going to be situationally useful at best. As well as the fact that they just don't have a real go-to late-game deathball army composition. So they have a lot of variety. They have a really flexible tech tree, but the cost of that is the fact that none of their units are especially top tier, except arguably the cataphract, and which is probably their main unit to go for with regards to a death ball. The problem is it's just not very easy to get up to cataphracts because of their staggering cost. Between the elite upgrade and logistica, the two most important technologies, you're looking at 2,600 food and 1,400 gold in upgrades. So that is just a staggering cost. That's just a staggering price tag, and you're not going to always be able to get up to them. And without them, the Byzantines, they're okay in the late game, but they're definitely nothing special. They're definitely more about responding and countering and that sort of thing. Next up on my A tier, we have the Japanese. And so this is another one of my overall top 5 favorite civs. And for Arena, they're decent, but they're definitely not quite at the top tier. With that being said, I think one of the things this civilization has going for it is the fact that they have one of the strongest, if not the strongest, dark ages of any civilization, and by extension, early game. Because the fast castle build abounds on Arena, where you're going to be making things like 2 lumber camps, a mining camp on gold, as well as a mill for your berries. And if you're thinking about those buildings for the Japanese, you're saving 200 wood just constructing those buildings and just going about your regular business. Like, that is a huge eco boost, and that can give you a solid booming basis, as well as if you want to make a monastery or a siege workshop for aggression potentially, you're essentially getting those buildings for free. So that's a really nice bonus to have. Speaking of monasteries, they also have great monks, missing only heresy, which is a loss, especially if you're going to be going into a monk war. But those are fairly hard to come by, in my experience, nowadays. And in any case, the Japanese military tends not to be super expensive, so it's not like monks are a hard counter to the civ like it might be for some other civs. They have some of the best infantry in the game, and the spotlight is probably most on their halberdiers. They are some of the best halbs in the game, and they're objectively the best halberdiers for dealing with any sort of cavalry. Light cavalry, heavy cavalry, super heavy cavalry like elephants, Japanese halberdiers can just deal with all of them the best in the game with their faster attacking bonus. They also have access to the samurai unique unit as far as infantry goes. And while it's a unit that's kind of expensive and slow to get up and running, if you are able to get them up and running, they can be fairly difficult for some civs to deal with. So I'm thinking other infantry-reliant civilizations like Celts, Malays sort of, and I guess you could say Slavs, although Slavs with their Druzhner unique tech are pretty strong, but I digress. These civilizations, if they're confronted with samurai, they can have a bit of a hard time, especially with some supporting units. Because the samurai, they inherently have a faster attack rate already compared to most other infantry, and they just attack that much faster when you couple that with the fact that the Japanese have that faster infantry attack bonus. And so they'll just shred up infantry units of almost any kind of infantry unit in the game en masse. So their late game, it's not absolutely amazing, but they do have good variety. So they have great infantry, a great variety of archers. They have amazing trebuchets with the catapulto unique technology. They have great monks. And they have reasonable defensive structures with their Yazama keeps. And that can be nice for supporting a push, or maybe even putting back home, maybe to defend yourself from raiding, that sort of thing. They're also quite well equipped for a trash war. So again, faster attacking infantry benefiting their halberdiers. So they got some great halberdiers for the post-imperial trash war stage of the game. They have fully upgraded skirmishers. And their light cav, I guess it's serviceable. They do lack plate barding armor, but at least they do get bloodlines, so I'd say they're overall still usable. Like Britons, unfortunately for the Japanese, their cavalry and their siege overall is somewhat lacking. Much like the Britons, their cavalry they're kind of stuck with light cav and cavalier that miss a critical upgrade. And in the case of siege, they have the exact same siege tech tree actually, and their trebuchets respectively get a bonus. They get a unique tech helping them out, but otherwise their siege is kind of underwhelming otherwise. And as a result, again, like I mentioned about the Byzantines previously, the fact that they have such a broad tech tree, but the fact that none of their units are necessarily top tier, they don't really have a go-to late game army composition. Some units might be good to have, like maybe a combination of, halberdiers, maybe they're strong archers like arbalests, heavy cav archers, hand cannoneers, maybe they're trebs, Yazama keeps for support. But otherwise, it's not really a focused late game, and it's not particularly powerful. It's not I wouldn't say it's a death ball compared to some of the S tier civs like Teutons, Slavs, Turks, even those kinds of civs. But overall, Japanese are still a great civ, in my opinion. They're a lot of fun to play. They're also a lot of fun to play, in my opinion. And although they do have some a few rough matchups, it's a civ I'm usually happy to see when I random them. Coming in 5th in my A tier, we have the Franks. Franks used to be considered a bottom tier arena civilization back in the AOC days, right alongside Persians, but they received a lot of buffs with the Lolo Kingdom's expansion regarding their economy as well as their military, and they're actually a really solid arena civilization nowadays. So, I think one of the Franks' best-selling features on this map is the fact that they have a real knack for securing map control, with their beefed-up scouts, potentially even light cav, as well as their knights. With this map control, they can grab themselves the relics and maybe potentially even secure a foothold nearby their enemy's base so they can apply some pressure, whether it's with a forward castle or with siege, in combination with their cavalry. Their economy is also quite solid with the forager bonus as well as the free farm upgrades. The free farm upgrades, it's not the biggest economy bonus out there, but it does still help out your mid-game boom a bit. You don't have to reseed your farms quite as quickly as farms with just horse collar, and so it can make for a pretty reasonable mid-game boom, even if it's not quite top tier in my opinion. And because you save on the resources needed to research the farm upgrades, and also the extra food that you get from your faster forager bonus, that's just a lot of extra food and wood that you can put towards your boom. So extra TCs, your keeping up vil productions at all of them, that sort of thing. They also have cheap castles. They cost 25% less each, and they can provide for an excellent option for mid-game pushing, map control, and defense. For in the context of defense, let's say your opponent is doing some kind of monk rush or other kind of generic aggression, and you can just put your defensive castle down for a lot cheaper just to drive them off. In the mid game, you can also maybe go aggressive with their castles. One of the Franks' more, I guess you could say, the patented YOLO strategies is probably just dropping castles forever inside nearby your opponent. So you'd build one nearby your opponent's base, bust through their walls, and then just keep putting on the castles, destroying their wall-offs, maybe even some villagers, denying important resources, assuming their map is really bad, that sort of thing. And the cheaper castles can also help you secure more resources on the map, assuming the neutral resources, the stone and the gold, spawn more outside the map. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they can spawn inside the opponent's yours or your opponent's bases, but assuming they are out in the middle, you can secure more of them and really help yourself out in the late game. Speaking of the late game, the Franks' late game is actually surprisingly diverse and powerful. When you think of Franks, the first thing that comes to your mind is probably knights, and knights and paladins later on in the late game. But when you look at the rest of their tech tree and context, you realize they actually have quite a good variety of supporting units against enemy halbs, which you're probably inevitably going to encounter being so heavy into cavalry. They have champions, they have hand cannoneers, they have throwing axemen to deal with those. Against enemy camels, if your opponent is a good camel civ, they have their own fully upgraded halberdiers to help support your knights that way. And they also have onagers and scorpions with siege engineers to help you against archers, as well as bombard cannons to help pushing into your opponent's town. Unfortunately for the Franks, they have a few downsides, and they're quite noticeable. The first is their monks, which unfortunately miss redemption and atonement. So without those two techs, many of the things that a monk is able to do are basically thrown out the window. But with that being said, they still do have some of the other important technologies like block printing, illumination, sanctity, theocracy. So as long as you're using the monks in a building converting or siege converting role, you can still use them perfectly fine. Like for example, if you're up against enemy camels or elephants even, you can use their monks to convert some of them to hopefully turn the tide of the battle that way. Their most glaring hole in their tech tree is probably the fact that their archery range is one of the worst in the game. They miss thumb ring, bracer, ring archer armor, and for the archery range tech tree itself, they miss arbalest, they miss Parthian tactics, and so it's just not a very good archery range to use. The only thing you might end up using is maybe their hand cannoneers, and even then their hand cannoneers are kind of fragile because, yeah, they miss out on some armor. And you may have some use for their skirmishers in the late game if the game goes to a full trash war phase, but overall, it's far from being a strong point for the Civ. That being said, the rest of their tech tree is fairly solid, good infantry, solid cavalry, decent enough siege, and so I can definitely overlook the poor archery range in a lot of cases, in a lot of circumstances. They're also rather goal dependent, being so heavily reliant on their knights for a good late game death ball. And this means you need a lot of gold to make sure that you can play the Franks at their fullest potential. And if you're not able to secure a lot of gold, that's going to be a problem later on down the line. But with that being said, because of their aforementioned ability to take map control very nicely, I think and their ability to build castles for so cheap, I think you definitely have a very good potential to secure more resources for yourself, more gold, more stone, things like that. And so you have a lot of potential to play the Franks at their fullest potential. So I really like the Civ. It has its problems, but they're strong enough, more than strong enough for me to justify putting an A tier. Sixth on my A tier, we have the Burmese. Burmese, you can kind of think of them as like a reverse Franks, so to speak. They were considered quite high tier on Arena, but they've been definitely knocked down a peg. Definitely nowhere near as significant as going from bottom tier to almost top tier like the Franks. But they probably, for Burmese, they've probably dropped somewhere around from top tier to maybe somewhat high mid tier, something like that. And for me, some of their best selling features is the fact that they have the second best battle elephants in the game after Khmer. And in some respects, I guess you could say they're better. For example, if you're facing a lot of ranged units, the extra pierce armor that they get with their Howdah unique technology can help them out in that regard. And also if you're worried about monks, because they do at least get access to faith, which of course the Khmer don't have. Although faith isn't a complete... having access to faith isn't exactly a makeup for the fact that the civilization does miss heresy, but that's another topic for another day. Their Relic Vision team bonus is actually pretty nice for Arena, at least in my opinion. I know some people who think it's not that big of a deal, but I personally like it because, let's say for example, you're luring a very bad deer patch. Like let's say they're just outside your walls, they're super far away, and you have to just juggle using your sheep to hold open gates and your scout to push the deer inside so they can get to your TC so you can gather from them. You could potentially miss out on some good scouting information, and the fact that you can see the relics on the map means you don't have to explore for them in those situations. And also, depending on the map layout, you can oftentimes figure out where your opponent is situated on the map, because relics usually don't generate very close to an opponent's base, as in like near their town center. So if you can connect the dots where the relics are and maybe see if there's a big dark patch on the map, you can probably safely assume that that's where your opponent is situated on the map. The Rambai unique unit that they have access to can be a decent option for taking map control or going aggressive. And just like with organ guns for Portuguese in my S tier, they do have no food costs, so it's easier for you. It's easier on your economy if you're trying to boom behind it at the same time. But in my opinion, it's not as good as the gunpowder unique units are for taking map control or going aggressive. That's just my opinion. And also my opinion, they are the single best civilization in the game for going for a smush or a fast imperial with monks and trebs push. Some will probably challenge that, and they might think as for the smushing in particular. Some might like Aztecs more, for example. Like they might like the good economy as well as the potential for tanky monks. But I personally prefer the potential to get the important monk texts like Sanctity, Redemption, perhaps even Atonement earlier than just having slightly tankier monks that admittedly are helpful, but I think is more relevant towards the later parts of the game. Their free wood upgrades means your eco will still be reasonably strong when going for a strategy like this, and the fact that your monk texts are discounted again means that if you're ever engaged in a monk war, for example, you can grab your the critical technologies like Atonement and whatnot just that much faster and turn the tide of the monk war right there. On top of that, in the late game, they have some of the best infantry in the game with their extra attack. So they get a total of +3 extra attack for free. So when you're trying to compare this bonus to, say, the Aztecs with their Garland Wars unique tech, that's a technology the Aztecs have to pay for in the Imperial Age for their infantry to become anything more than special. And the fact that the Burmese get their own attack bonus, even though it's slightly weaker, for free, I think just makes this a better bonus compared to the Garland Wars unique tech that the Aztecs have. Of course, with those high points also have to come low points. And for the Burmese, like the Franks before them, is their archery range. Their archery range is actually even worse than the Franks, believe it or not. They miss Arbalest, they miss Hand Cannoneer, they miss they get Parthian Tactics, they miss Thumb Ring, and they miss 2 archer upgrades at the Blacksmith. They only get the first one. So with that in mind, their archers really aren't usable in the late game at all. You have to rely on their other units. And as a result of their poor variety of archer techs, I think it hurts their skirmishers the most. And because their skirmishers are just so flimsy to ranged attacks, it means strong archer civs can have a field day with Burmese potentially. So think of civs like Britons, Mayans, Ethiopians, those very strong archer civilizations. Because the Burmese only clean answers to ranged units are just generic onagers with siege engineers, and maybe their battle elephants with the Howdah unique technology, which, battle elephants being as expensive as they are to get up to, it's not always going to be something that's attainable in a 1v1. On top of that, even though they have a great monastery tech tree, the one tech they miss is his heresy, which, depending on the context and what you're up against, can be a pretty big loss. So their best units like elephants, Arambai, maybe some of their siege weapons, onagers, bombard cannons, they can be quite vulnerable to conversions. Although the fact that they get the faith technology half price can make up for that somewhat. The 7th and final civilization in my A tier is the Malians. It's one of the most flexible and adaptable civs in the game regarding its tech tree and bonuses. This is one of those civs that you can feel good about going with in a full random, knowing that the Malians will do their job on just about any map type. And they are pretty good on Arena as well. They have an amazing early and mid-game eco with their cheaper buildings as well as their free gold mining tech. It can help with a variety of things. It can help you booming in the mid-game. It can also help you with a smush especially. And this civilization, at least for Arena, almost seems like it's designed to go for that strategy because you save wood and you get faster gold efficiency, which are the two, and wood and gold are the 2 main resources you're going to be using while you're in a smush. So it's a pretty nice civ for that strategy. On top of that, they have a top tier early and power spike potential because of the Farimba unique technology, the Cavalier upgrade, as well as the plate barding armor tech at the Blacksmith. Assuming you have all the resources necessary to get all these techs, you have the potential to have 19 attack Cavaliers out on the field in early Imperial Age, and that is definitely a force to be reckoned with. Their infantry with high pierce armor can also be extremely deadly if the opponent is caught off guard. I remember I was a game once as Burmese against Malians. I defended pretty well against my Malians opponent's initial attack early in Imperial Age, but then out of sight, he built several barracks. He got all his swordsman upgrades, partly abusing the market, and then he just completely caught me off guard. He broke down my walls and completely wrecked my eco. And getting caught off guard by Champ Scarls is not fun. Trust me. I speak from first-hand experience. Unfortunately for Malians, they have a lackluster post-Imperial Age, and so when you look at their tech tree, it's a nice open tech tree, but in it, you have very noticeable holes. In the Blacksmith, they miss Bracer and Blast Furnace, which hurts their archers and their infantry respectively. They don't have siege rams, they don't have siege engineers, and they have no halberdiers. And these are all units and techs that I as a player end up using a lot, if not almost every single game. And so the fact that the Malians don't have access to them really just doesn't sit too well with me personally. They're looking at their trash lines, focusing in on their pikemen, It's one of the worst spear lines in the game for dealing with enemy cavalry. Yes, they have high pierce armor, but that helps most against ranged units. We're talking about up close and personal melee engagements with cavalry, and the fact that they miss halberdier as well as not getting the blast furnace tech means their pikes aren't going to be super useful in that role. But thankfully, they do have good camels with the Farimba tech to somewhat make up for that. And so you won't be completely out of it if you run into a lot of heavy cavalry. They don't have a single fully upgraded trash unit for post-Imperial Age during the Trash War phase. Their light cavalry with Farimba at least are quite decent, although they still fall short to Hussars in certain situations, like if you're up against a lot of ranged units, where the 15 extra HP that Hussars get over light cav can make a bit of a difference. But that being said, if you properly budget for it, much like in the same way with Malay with getting their forced levy technology before they completely run out of gold, assuming you can budget properly and get all your swordsman techs as well as the upgrades of the blacksmith, their champions, their extremely tanky champions can prove to be a great asset during trash wars. And yeah, so their Malians, although their trash tech tree isn't the best, they still can function in a trash war just fine. And just the fact that they fall off so dramatically in Imperial Age, and the fact that they have so many noticeable holes in their tech tree, as a player, I just find them a bit awkward to play at certain stages of the game. But where they are undeniably very strong is in the early to mid game, and it's for that reason that I have to put them in A tier. And so with that, that'll close out my A tier. In the next video, I'll be exploring the B tier, so 7 more civs coming up. And yeah, just keep an eye out for that, and until next time.